one of the central questions that we need to sort of look at for New York in terms of climate change is the idea of sea level rise. And connected to that is the issue of what that might mean in terms of how we manage our buildings, our infrastructure, closer to the water's edge. We are a place of a tremendous built environment. There is approximately 500,000 plus buildings in the city of New York. 80% of the building stock that we have today will still be around in 2030. That's the estimate. So, the city that we have today is the one we'll have tomorrow. That's the underlying issue here. And with that, what we have to assume is we have to sort of figure out a way of retrofitting those buildings to get them, to be energy efficient, sustainable, quote unquote. We know that New York is sinking. That's well established. And why is it sinking? Well, about 11,000 years ago, there were glaciers to the north of New York, and they were big. They're like a mile thick, and they weighed that part of the landmass down. And it was sort of like a seesaw effect. So here we are up in northern New England or whatever with a lot of ice pressing down, and the land to the south went upward a little bit. That ice is gone, has been for thousands of years, and there's something called isostatic rebound. So that those northern locations are sort of rising, and the southern locations are sinking. And we're to the southern end of that hinge zone. So we're actually geologically, we've been going down about 1 inch per decade, so about that much. With sea level rise, that same event that flooded in 2009, 30 feet, because of the gentle slope of the land, might actually flood 40 or 50 or 60 feet, depending on the amount of sea level rise that we have occurring. And if you have a flooding event in a house every 100 years, or very infrequently, maybe every half century or less, what it might mean to a house is that it has to be gutted and totally rehabilitated, and maybe you would make that investment. But if it happens every 10 years, then the logic becomes a little bit different. So the question of whether or not there will be a seawall around New York is quite interesting. We're actually looking at that as part of the New York City panel on climate change, and we'll make a recommendation with respect to that. We haven't sort of finalized a recommendation. My own perspective on it is that it is something that requires an intense amount of study. There are some cases where seawalls have been effective. There are other cases where, because of economic or social or environmental concerns, the costs have been very significant. The 20th century taught us, in many ways, that the technological fix, building a levee or a barrier, isn't always the best approach. Because what happens is that it gives and provides a sort of false sense of security, coupled with the fact that we don't really understand how that levee will be managed and protected in terms of its operation over the long term. I mean, if you look at New Orleans as an example, there were levees around New Orleans, but it seems that the management of the levees and the protection of them, particularly during times of extreme flooding events, became the crucial linchpin to their failure. And so the presence of the levees created an opportunity for extensive residential development in places that otherwise wouldn't have been developed. As a result, the costs were devastating when they failed. And there, again, the 20th century is this history of building physical structures to protect population or property. Then when they fail, you have a tremendously exposed property and population. And so in the context of New York, we obviously are dealing with tremendous risks with respect to exposure.